Welcome to the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum, the leading authority on cyber, information security, and risk management. I'm Tavia Gilbert, and I'm glad to welcome you back to another cutting-edge conversation tailored to CISOs, CTOs, CROs, and other global security pros. In every episode of ISF's media, Managing Director Steve Durbin speaks with rule breakers, collaborators, culture builders, and business creatives who manage their enterprises with vision, transparency, authenticity, and integrity. And he brings that conversation to you, your teams, and your partners. Today, Steve is in conversation with writer and researcher Brigid Schulte, author of the New York Times best-selling book on time pressure, Overwhelmed: Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time. Formerly an award-winning journalist for The Washington Post and The Washington Post magazine, and part of the team that won the 2008 Pulitzer Prize, Schulte is a global speaker on time, productivity, leisure, and the value of play, and she serves as the founding director of the Good Life Initiative at the nonpartisan think tank New America. She's also the director of the Better Life Lab, a work, family, justice, and gender equity program. In today's conversation, Steve and Brigid discuss the need for leadership, a need that during COVID is more urgent than ever before, how to make work better for everyone, and the opportunity for enterprises to remeasure what they value and reestablish the value system that threads through the heart of everything they do. Brigid's first comment to Steve, as they begin to discuss their common vision of leadership, reveals her passion for the vital and timely topic of leadership during global disruption.
If there was ever a time for leadership, this is the time. This is a critical moment for leaders to really figure out how to do things differently and really step up. This is a challenging moment.
So I wanted to start with a reference to your book, Overwhelmed. I mean, that was written, 5-6 years ago now. It was a New York Times bestseller. And you really sort of went into some of the circumstances around individuals, families, employees from that perspective a few years back. But of course, that was all pre-pandemic. And there was a lovely description of it that I read on Amazon where it was described as being a trip down the rabbit hole of busyness. And I thought that was such a wonderful way of describing a book that really tries to capture, all of this challenge that we've all faced of so many things to do and the perception that there's so little time to do it. And I want to get into that in a moment or two. But first, what was your real sort of first personal call to action in that space? How did you come to write that book? What was the driver?
It was a totally accidental book. I actually didn't really want to write that book. I actually sort of rebelled against it for a while. I was working full-time as a reporter at the Washington Post. I had 2 pretty little kids. I just felt like I was losing my mind. I felt like I was never adequate enough at work. I felt like I was totally inadequate at home. I just never felt like I could do enough. And I thought it was all my fault, that it was just me. And sort of the national dialogue, if you remember from the media or whatever, was all like, oh, just take a bath. Or if you can't figure it out, it's all your fault. And so I kind of internalized it and I gained 30 pounds. I broke out in stress eczema. I got maybe 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night. I was really falling apart and kept it all to myself. I had a very brave face at work. I had a brave face for my kids and at home. And I was part of this working group at the Washington Post. We were looking at readership numbers, and they were seeing this big difference between male and female readers. And so the powers that be got this women readers group together to figure out why are women not reading the newspaper. And I was appointed to this group, and we all looked around at each other, sort of rolled our eyes, and then that facade sort of dropped, like, well, duh, we know why women aren't reading the newspaper, because mornings are crazy. Everybody was so busy. They either had kids or they had elder care or they were taking care of other, there were all these really heavy caregiving responsibilities that many of our male colleagues simply did not have or did not think about or were delegated to them and would do it occasionally. But that day-to-day heavy responsibility really was on all these women. And so we wanted to find some data to say, well, women are busy. Let's just find some data. And so I volunteered. I found a time use researcher and I said, we're doing a study about why women aren't reading the newspaper and we figured they're too busy. And he interrupted me and he said, wrong. Women aren't busy. Nobody's busy. Women have 30 hours of leisure a week. Men have 40 hours of leisure a week. If people are feeling that they have time pressure, basically they're big babies. There's plenty of time. What's wrong with you? And I said, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have 30 hours of leisure a week. I can barely I felt like I was holding on by my fingernails. And he just said, yes, you do. Come and do a time study with me and I will show you where your leisure is. And honestly, that's how this book started. I did the time study with him. He found 27 hours of what he called leisure, and I called bits and scraps of garbage time, like 2 minutes here, 10 minutes there. And the key was waiting for a tow truck when my old station wagon broke down, taking my daughter to ballet class, and we were waiting for a tow truck for 2 hours. And he categorized that as leisure time. I'm like, are you out of your mind? It's like, I don't think this is what the Greeks were talking about as the good life. So I wrote a magazine story for the Washington Post magazine that really went viral. And I told my editor, I said, I'm going to be honest to the point of not getting fired, because I was really afraid that if I opened up, if I dropped that facade, that people were going to say it was all my fault. I was crazy. I was neurotic. And some people did say that online. But what amazed me was so many people reached out by email or phone or on the street. And it was a stack so high, I printed it out because I couldn't get to it all at once. And almost to a one, they said, you climbed into my head and you wrote about my life. And at that point, I realized this cannot be just massive personal failure. There's something else going on. And so that was what the book became, was this journey to try to understand, why are things the way they are? Why are so many people feeling overwhelmed? Certainly working mothers, but they're more the canary in the coal mine for everyone. And what can we do about it? And use my skills as a reporter. Listen, I love all those 10 ways to do this, 5 ways to do that lists, but I really wanted to use my skills as a reporter to try to really understand how could it be better. And honestly, that has changed the trajectory of my life. And that is now my job. I'm now the director of the Better Life Lab at New America, the Work Family Justice and Gender Equity Program. And I spend my days looking at that questions, how can we make this better for everyone?
That was 5, 6 years ago. Bringing it right up to date, of course, in the here and now. Everybody is in the midst of COVID-19, different levels of restrictions, depending on where you happen to be in the world. The impact on not just the world of work, but on everybody really has been unprecedented. How has that insight that you gained through writing the book, how can that be applied today to help people cope with some of the challenges that we're facing?
First thing that I will say is that so much of what I ended up finding in my reporting and my research is the world has shifted for so many people, and yet our workplaces, our work cultures haven't shifted to keep up. Many of our social policies haven't shifted to keep up, and our cultural expectations haven't shifted. So you've got this big disconnect going on. And what COVID has done is really laid that bare for everyone. Now everyone can see this disconnect. Whereas maybe a couple of years ago, I felt like I was sort of crying in the wilderness, that nobody seemed to care or listen to these issues, that childcare is an economic issue, that businesses should care about that. You could maybe get on the business page, never on the front page. And now you're seeing it on the front pages of newspapers, top of radio and TV broadcasts. So there is a much bigger recognition that these work-life issues and how we combine work and care are central to living a good life. They're central to economies. They're central to business. We need to stop this old-fashioned thinking that you have this work self and you can work all the time, and then you have this life self, and somehow they're separate. We're supposed to work as if we don't have a life, and we're supposed to have a life as if we don't work, and that's just impossible. So I'd say that's the first thing, is that there's this recognition now that systems were not working, and there's a real opportunity now to do things differently. I look at change on the personal level, on the organizational level, and then also on the societal level. And if you're asking about what can people do personally, I think that's the first thing, is to be aware that you're in an unprecedented time that's really difficult, and the systems weren't working very well beforehand, so that there are boundaries that you can set, that there are personal mastery things that you can do. But I think the most important thing is to understand it's not all your fault, that there are these larger systems that don't work. So put your own oxygen mask on, and let's be part of this larger change to figure out what does new normal look like.
And one of the things certainly that I think a lot of people are struggling with is this concept of home working. Depending on who you talk to, some people see it as they've arrived finally at nirvana. They can work from home. But one of the concerns that I have with that, and certainly with the people that I work with, is that by bringing work into the home, you've actually created now this hothouse environment where you're always on. You don't have the commute time, for instance, just that. Getting people to understand that it's important to switch off, to take breaks, to do all those sorts of things. And from a leadership standpoint, I'm not a fan of remote monitoring and then telling somebody, okay, now it's time for you to have a break. I mean, that for me is something that I find actually quite deplorable, because it really brings into question this whole trust issue.
I totally agree. If you are doing that to your employees, you have to just really, really wonder what kind of culture you have created. If you cannot trust your people to do what you've asked them to do, to deliver on what your value proposition is, boy, that is a time for you to do some deep introspection. I find that beyond deplorable. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, absolutely fine. No, please do.
That just infuriates me when I read about
but it
that.
exists, doesn't it? I mean, we've all seen, examples of that. And like you, it's not something that actually had occurred to me that people would even want to do. But the thing that does concern me more, I think, is from a leadership position, how can you encourage people who you don't see on a regular basis anymore to basically look after themselves, to be able to give of their best, where giving of their best actually doesn't mean being locked to a computer screen for 8 to 10 to 12 to 14 hours a day?
Exactly. I mean, it's so interesting that this, as difficult a time as this actually is also a time of opportunity for organizations, for businesses, for leaders. This is a time to really get clear on your culture and connect it with the purpose. What is the purpose of a corporation? What is the purpose of your company? Really connect that with what people are doing and why it matters. Keep your eye on that North Star, if you will. This is so important. People are feeling so disconnected and so isolated. So communication is important, but I think the first thing is getting clarity about that purpose, communicating that really clearly, and then finding ways. Oh, I think we're all zoomed out, but finding ways to not only connect for the mission and the purpose, but finding ways to recreate hallway moments, the times where you could just bump into somebody and an idea would spark. That's much more difficult in a virtual environment. But just last week, I did that. I sort of had virtual coffee with 2 team members that I don't really see all that often. And I went for a walk because I just could not stand being on Zoom anymore. That performance is right. You're always on. And that just made a huge difference to hear about how they're doing and what's meaningful to them right now. What are they struggling with? And then as a leader, trying to find creative solutions together for how to keep them engaged and excited and productive, because that is a challenge. So I think clarity, purpose, really thinking about the culture you're creating and communicating with a sense of compassion that this is hard for all of us. And I think this is the time when you think about the surveillance and popping in on people on Zoom, that's a culture of mistrust. That's a culture of, I'm going to catch you out, I've got you. And I think that it's so clear when you look at innovation and productivity, you don't want that kind of punitive atmosphere. You want something that draws people, that gets them motivated and excited. And that's all about purpose and direction and where you're going, and being really clear about that and communicating it well.
And I think one of the challenges for some leaders in organizations is that if they are of a certain age, let's say, they've probably been brought up on that Jack Welch philosophy, the quarterly shareholder meeting, where as long as you can continue to drive profits up, keep your shareholders happy, that's all that matters. Culturally, of course, we've moved on significantly from that. I mean, I'm in the fortunate position of working at a not-for-profit, so we have slightly different perspectives on things. But it does strike me that there are probably some leaders out there who want to change, but don't really know how to do it. Any sort of tips, advice on those sort of first steps that they could take?
I think the important thing is to think about what matters is what you measure. And in that Jack Welch philosophy of shareholder returns and profits, and I think the thing that's always been the problem with that approach is the balance sheet is very narrow, and it doesn't take into account the much larger view of how people are actually living or what's actually going on in society at that moment. And so I think that this is the time to rethink your value proposition. What is it that you're measuring? What is it that you value? There's plenty of research that shows that well-rested, healthy, happy employees who are paid reasonably well and feel supported and feel stable, they do better work. That's just not hard. But When you've got a mindset that people are a cost of labor and they're like a number on a spreadsheet, then you want to cut labor costs. And so I think you're talking about first steps. This is a time to think beyond the balance sheet. And the intangibles are actually, the sort of the soft things are the most important things right now. Health and well-being, communication, all those soft skills that don't necessarily show up in those profit and loss statements. And yet, those are the things that will have an enormous impact on your productivity, on your culture, and on whether you're going to not only weather this crisis, but move beyond it and thrive.
You touch on there something I want to go into in a bit more detail, this whole concept of health and well-being. I think one of the concerns certainly that I have, and I'm sure many of the people listening to this, is the impact of the pandemic, the impact of rolling lockdowns in some countries on mental health, on loneliness, on anxiety, on a whole range of things. And we've just said, we don't have the luxury of being able to physically see people. And so we may not be able to spot some of these things. Any sort of insight that you can give in that area around that whole concept of things to watch out for, or things to help people improve and deal with those issues themselves?
Yeah, this is where communication is so important. Being really clear about your purpose and your mission, and then how does the work flow from that? And being really clear about somebody's roles and responsibilities and the expectations then. Like, what is it that they're supposed to deliver? Being clear on that, but also having a sense of conversation, because now you've got a whole lot of people who are homeschooling at home, or they've got childcare, or they're worried about their aging parent who's isolated and they can't see in the nursing home. There's just so many more heavy responsibilities that people are struggling with day to day, that I've seen some firms when they talk about responding to COVID, they're going to rethink performance evaluations. I think that is a given. That's just the bottom line.
Right.
Really rethink what your expectations are and communicate them, because you see so many people where the expectations are not different, or they haven't been communicated. Maybe the leaders think, oh, we're going to cut people a little slack. We know that this is difficult. But then what you see on the flip side is people who are afraid of being laid off. They're afraid of this economic downturn. So they are overperforming and they're really burning themselves out. So this is when it's incumbent upon leaders to really look at, what time are people sending emails? What time are you sending emails or communicating? And then having a conversation, because sometimes people time shift. So it's not like they're working constantly. Maybe they've taken the dog for a walk and then they're back on, and that's part of the way that they work. Because as we are working at home, some people find solace in ritual, and there are people who are work-life separators, and they want to work and then they take a break and then they work again. Other people are fusion lovers, and then everything is sort of like all blurring one thing into another. And this is when it's important to have those conversations, to kind of know or understand or have conversations about what somebody's work style is, what suits them, what works with the mission and the goals of the organization. Have those conversations and creatively come up with solutions together. There's no one right way to do this. We're all figuring it out.
One of the things that has struck me is that some of us were probably very good at that in the early days because it was fresh, it was new, we knew we had to do something. As this home working, remote working, call it what you will, has sort of dragged on, and indeed, unfortunately, it looks as if it's set to continue for some while to come yet, we may well have forgotten some of those things. And so it's worth just going back round, re-emphasizing and looking at what has worked and what hasn't worked quite so well, perhaps, and making some of those in-flight changes. Are there any sort of success stories that you can point to about workplaces that you know of that have shifted in what you would term to sort of healthy or productive ways because of the pandemic?
Yeah, there's a couple so I've been working on a project with Ideas 42 and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, looking at the drivers of work-life conflict and then interventions that can kind of disrupt that to make work-life balance, if you want, work-life harmony, fit, integration, whatever you want to call it, time for work and life better, and then also finding that work is better. And there's this one nonprofit did something very interesting. They were seeing that people, as you know, in nonprofits and in many places, people love what they do, and so it's hard to turn off. One of the things that we heard from people is, it's like, well, I'd have work-life balance if I hated my job. So then you have that sense of mission and drive. So it's really difficult to get people to turn off or take time away, like vacation or time for rest and recovery, in normal times or pre-pandemic times. And in the pandemic, it's almost as if nobody felt like they could take vacation, or if you could, you couldn't go anywhere. So how was that different? And so what they began doing is tracking when people were taking time off. And if you hadn't taken time off in a while, then they would basically put a day on your calendar, send you and your manager an email saying, hey, we've noticed you haven't had time off in a while. How about you take this Friday off? If that Friday doesn't work, feel free to shift it, but you need to take some time off. Giving this message from the leadership that time off is important, and copying the manager, who would then often say, yes, please do. Oftentimes managers and leaders are the worst role models. They work all the time.
Yeah.
And so then everybody thinks they have to work like that leader. And believe me, I'm guilty of this too. I'm a leader and I have a very difficult time unplugging. So you have to really make sure that you not only talk the talk, but you try to walk the walk as well. And so this is a great way to do that. So people feel that they're noticed, that they're understood, and that their work is valued, and that their life is valued too, and that there's time for time away, to recharge, to rest, do something you enjoy, to reconnect with your family. And that is important in and of itself. It's not only going to make you better and fresher at work, but there's a value in having that kind of time. In a pandemic, when we are around so much illness and death, this is a moment to recognize our lives are short. We are so much more than our work identities. And how do we create systems that recognize that certainly value work? Particularly in America, we're a very work-focused, work-identified nation, and there's benefits to that. There's also downsides to that. And how do we create space for really valuing the fullness of our human lives, all of us?
I think that's a very good point. And if I think about certainly the security industry, a lot of the people listening to this will be from that particular part of work, and they will know that throughout the pandemic, they've been rushed off their feet, not just having to move everybody from a relatively secure corporate environment out into the home environment and putting in place all of the systems and so on there, but then just keeping things up and running. And very often, I think we do see instances of burnout. We see some challenges that chief information security officers have around not just continuing to motivate their staff correctly, but also themselves and some of the challenges they face in trying to do that. But one of the things that I've noticed, certainly over the last few months, is that having been forced into necessarily having to work away from your normal environment, a number of people have become very much more innovative. They've had to think outside. They've had to really try to overcome problems that perhaps they weren't aware existed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a real positive, isn't it? So, holding on to some
Absolutely.
of those things. And I think that there's probably a bit of a danger if people talk about, and I hate this phrase, the new normal or returning to normal. For me, it doesn't
I'm sorry, and
exist.
I already used it.
What do you really sort of hope the pandemic and perhaps some of the challenges we've just been talking about that people have been facing, what do you think that those will do to inspire people as far as sort of innovation and perhaps making some long-term positive changes?
Yeah, I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind, not only the challenges, but also the opportunities of this era. I mean, when you think about it, before the pandemic, I've written a lot about remote and flexible work. There was so much resistance to it before the pandemic. So many leaders, managers, companies would say, we simply can't do it. It's not possible. In times of downturn, when there might have been some kind of work redesign or creative or flexible, innovative pilot, they would pull the plug at the first sign of problem and say, everybody in the office, all hands on deck, return to the status quo. Oh my God, we got to cling to what we know, even though the data was pretty clear it wasn't working. Maybe it was working for the Jack Welch perspective, but it certainly was not working for human beings. So here, people have had to go remote in white collar settings. People are shocked by how much they have been able to do. They've been shocked by how productive people have been, even under such challenging circumstances with no childcare, with no schools. Even in the education setting, talking to teachers, they've had to be so much more creative, being able to try to connect with students in a virtual setting. So I think that that's one thing, is that you don't know what you can do until you're really faced with a challenge. And then I think that most organizations need to feel incredibly proud of themselves for making the switch so quickly, and in many cases, really so beautifully. I mean, I hesitate to use that word, but it's really exciting to see what so many companies have done. So I think that that's something to hold on to. I think the other thing to think about, when I was talking before, that the way I got into this is feeling these really heavy caregiving responsibilities that my husband certainly didn't feel. Now you've got so many people kind of on top of each other at home, it's very difficult. There's no doubt that the research shows that women are still bearing the brunt of a lot of that caregiving and the homeschooling in a dangerous way. You see that in the unemployment figures. You see that in surveys where it's more likely to be women who are cutting back or dropping out. So I think that's something to keep in mind. So what does onboarding look like? How do we make sure that those women don't suffer long-term consequences with their careers? I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind. On the flip side of it, now you've got so many more men who are spending so much more time at home, seeing just how much work there is to do, the unpaid work of care, the unpaid work of keeping a house running. I interviewed this one man. He thought that he was really woke and, that they shared things very equally. And then he realized just how unfair things were once he had to go remote and they were always working on top of each other. And he said, yeah, I used to walk by a pile of unfolded laundry and not even see it. And he said, now I can't walk by it without realizing that if I don't do something about it, it means that my wife will, and that she's going to be up really late because I never thought that that was my job. And so they're having to communicate a whole lot more effectively about, well, what's the whole bucket of work that it takes to run a household? And are there ways that we can share it more fairly? So I think that there are all sorts of potential long-term, potentially very positive changes that could come out of this at work and also at home.
One of the other positives, certainly that I've noticed, is with this remote working, it really doesn't matter anymore where people are physically located. And that is hugely liberating, I think, from an employer's standpoint. So, again, back in the security space, we talk a lot about skill shortages. Well, the fact that people can now work remotely opens up a whole part of the population, whether it be because you originally had thought that they had to live in a certain urban area, perhaps, but it also opens the door to more women, the ability to do things like job share, the ability to blend some of the requirements of childcare and all of the other things. But it also opens the door to the disabled and a whole range of other opportunities there as well. So for me, that's one of the really exciting areas I think that the pandemic has shone a light on, in that there is a whole range of skills out there that for a lot of people, and you could say, well, shame on you, but the reality is that I think a lot of businesses were very focused on needing to have people who were within an easy commutable distance, could physically turn up to do the job and just fit it in. And all of that has now just been completely blown out of the water, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think that that is another potentially very exciting thing. Even in my own team, the deputy director, we're based in Washington, D.C. I'm in Alexandria, Virginia, right outside. She moved to Utah. She and her fiance were living in this teeny tiny apartment. They were both trying to work remotely, driving each other crazy. Everything was shut down. It's not like they could go anywhere. So they moved to Utah. They bought a house. And you know what? We've been more productive than ever in these last several months. So it just shows you things that you thought you couldn't do, you really can. And I think that is really exciting. Think about what that could mean for the revival of smaller cities or even rural areas. We've got a friend in a beautiful area of Central Oregon. He's a home builder. He said that his business has gone up 1,000% because all of these people are leaving crowded, expensive cities and moving to smaller, beautiful places where they can have a much different standard of living and still do that same high-powered job. So I think there's potential for very exciting possibilities, not just for businesses and the way we organize and the way we work, but also what that could mean for cities, rural areas, for knitting the fabric of society together, for economic development. I mean, I think that the possibilities are really very exciting.
Positive transformation coming from something that on the face of it is pretty challenging, pretty miserable, and which I think everybody hopes will come to an end as soon as possible.
Yes, indeed. Yes,
in a positive way. Brigid, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for taking the time and sharing some of your insights.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to connect with you virtually.
Thanks, Brigid.
The perhaps bad news is that there's no easy new template that can be applied across the board to answer every challenge for today's newly diversified workforces. But Schulte's good news is that there is new opportunity and new promise in deepening trust and relationship, taking the time to listen and respond to the needs of your people, and to finding creative ways to reconnect with your driving value system, and remeasuring the value you get and give within your organization. In our next episode, Steve speaks with another guest whose focus includes human culture, human behavior, and storytelling. Singer-songwriter and activist Sir Bob Geldof, lead singer of the Boomtown Rats and founding member of Band-Aid, famous for raising money for Ethiopian famine relief. Steve and Sir Bob discuss the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on creativity, the political turmoil facilitated by rapidly advancing digital technology, his hope for fresh ideas, the courage to embrace change, and more. Here's a preview of that conversation with Sir Bob Geldof.
You will not survive in a desert on your own. You will not survive in the bush on your own. You won't survive in a city on your own. Look at the mental health problems thrown up by the pandemic, the loneliness. You don't survive. It's only through cooperation. It's only through consensus. It's only through compromise. And the leader that can amalgamate that in the self and with a sense of purpose.
We look forward to bringing you the full interview. In the meantime, we invite you to tune into our catalog of video and podcast episodes, all of which you can find at securityforum.org. If you feel like today's conversation was of value, you can subscribe to the audio feed wherever you get your podcasts, and we'd be so grateful if you'd recommend us. Growing our subscriber numbers helps us reach new audiences and helps us continue to bring you these timely discussions. You can always join in the conversation on our LinkedIn page at linkedin.com/company/information-security-forum, or get in touch directly through our website, where you can also download ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like these. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox and Tavia Gilbert. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Assistant producer Katie Flood. Mix and master by Brian Barney. Thanks for listening.